Hello everyone, you are listening to Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak. It's an honor to have Professor Erik Angner from Stockholm University joins us as our distinguished guest on today's podcast episode. Dr. Erik's interdisciplinary expertise bridges economics and philosophy. He holds dual PhDs in economics and in history and philosophy of science from the University of Pittsburgh, a path shaped, as he puts it, by serious mission creep. Dr. Erik is the author of Hayek and Natural Law and the widely used textbook, A Course in Behavioral Economics. His scholarly work spans behavioral and experimental economics, the economics of happiness, and the philosophical foundations of economic theory. His widely acclaimed book, How Economics Can Save the World, brings economic thinking to bear on today's most urgent global challenges. In this episode, Professor Erik shares valuable insights from his book, How Economics Can Save the World, Simple Ideas to Solve Our Biggest Problems. So without further delay, let's welcome Professor Erik Angner to the podcast. Professor Erik, it's an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Well, thank you so much, Deepak. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah. Dr. Erik, you opened the book with a bold claim, Economics Can Save the World. What first convinced you of this idea, and why do you think most people still see economics as a cold or abstract?
Now, in a way, I take myself to be defending an old-fashioned and relatively uncontroversial idea, which is the idea that science as a social enterprise is useful in order to live better lives and to build a better society and a better world. The novelty, I guess, is that I want to make this case also in the context of economics and social and behavioral science. And the funny thing is that like many people who would agree with a general claim disagree with the specific claim about economics. I guess economics in general has like a terrible PR department, and I felt like it's important that somebody make the case for social and behavioral science as a way of like making the world a better place. Because as you and I and everybody knows, there's so much that needs to be fixed, isn't there?
The book is full of everyday examples, from parenting to organ donation. Can you share a surprising instant where economic thinking made a real difference in a personal or social issue?
Yes, so part of what I want to do is just give the reader a sense for sort of just how wide the scope is of economics and how it can apply at the micro level in our individual lives and interactions, and at the macro level, at the scale of a nation, or even bigger than a nation. And just as one example, I think the organ donation story that you mentioned is really kind of helpful because, organs are in like desperately short supply, as you know. There are lots of people who lack an organ of some kind, and there aren't enough to go around. Now, sometimes people, including economists, suggest that what we ought to be doing is just to have like a free market, like a Wild West in like human organs. But as things are in almost every country, in India and in the US and in Sweden and elsewhere, you're not allowed to put your kidney, for example, on eBay. And for good reason, right? For ethical and practical reasons. And so economists have been struggling with sort of how one can help figure this out. And an economist called Al Roth, an economics Nobel laureate who's like the hero of this story, sort of came to realize that the organs are really a lot like certain kinds of models that economists use. Because the thing is, organs aren't in fact in short supply. Like we have more than we need, in the sense that most of us have two kidneys when we only need one. And there are people who are willing to donate, either just out of the goodness of their heart or because they want to save a loved one, a spouse or child or parent or something along those lines. And so what Roth realized is that we have a sort of market, or we could have a sort of market, just not the kind of commodity market that people might have in mind. So this is called a matching market. And in order to set a market like this up, Roth sort of threw the entire toolbox at the problem. He started with mathematical modeling, sort of very abstract mathematical theorems. He used statistics, of course, in econometrics. He used game theoretic modeling and the concept of a Nash equilibrium, and then he ran experiments to sort of set this up. And at the end of the day, he sort of built an institution that he successfully sold to the medical profession and to patient advocates and so on, which is now in operation and which has saved tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of lives.
Dr. Eric, many people associate economics with stock market or GDP, not inequality or climate change. How does your book challenge that narrow view of the discipline?
Yeah. So when I tell people in airplanes and so on that I'm an economist, like oftentimes the first question is like, what sort of stocks should I buy? And I have no idea about what sort of stocks one should buy. And I think that reflects sort of a misconception about what economics is. And the thing is, like economics for the last 100 years or like forever, for 250 years, has been sort of the science of well-being and welfare and like a good life and the material and other preconditions for a good life. So economics is really it's a study of behavior, right? It's a social science, but it's also the study of institutions within which we behave and the conditions under which those institutions deliver the kind of things we're interested in as human beings, which is, in many cases anyway, welfare. So economics is like directly and immediately relevant to everything that has to do with human welfare, well-being, which is very broad indeed. This includes GDP and the stock market, right? Because the labor markets and the way they operate is like incredibly and immediately relevant to the quality of our lives. But it also involves things like schooling, of course, and education and marriage and partnership and family formation and happiness and the way we think about things and social interactions, social institutions, social norms. Like all of these things fall within the purview of economics.
You describe economics as a lens for understanding the world. What does that mean in practice, and how can non-economics apply that lens in their daily lives?
Yes, yeah. I want to move away from this idea that you mentioned of economics being defined by its scope in terms of like money or something like that. And I want to shift toward a frame where we think of economics as a way of approaching the world, as a way of addressing social problems. And the way that I and many people sort of phrase it or cash that out is in terms of an economic way of thinking. So the idea is that there is a specific framework or a way of addressing social problems that economists endorse. It doesn't mean that you have to be an economist to think in these terms, but it's the kind of way that we use to identify like what economics is and what it can accomplish. And to some extent, it's just like good old-fashioned critical reasoning, right? Using logical arguments and data and statistics and so on. But then it also has to do with things like paying attention to opportunity costs. Like when you choose one thing, you always have to give something else up. Right? If you choose to work on a Saturday, you know that might be great, right? But there are all sorts of things that you're giving up when you make that choice, like time with your family, maybe some leisure, maybe some sports, maybe a second job, like whatever it is. So paying attention to opportunity cost is one thing. Then there's this idea of thinking of the margin, thinking in terms of like the last unit of something. So people often ask questions like, can you buy happiness for money? Will more money make me happier? And on the average, the answer is yes. But in many contexts, whatever the average is, isn't that important. What matters is what applies to me, given where I am. Now, if I'm poor, I have trouble finding food for my family, or if I have trouble making ends meet, or something along those lines, well, then what the research suggests is that more money really will make me happier. If I can get to a point where I don't constantly have to worry about what my children will eat today, that will make me happier. But if I'm already relatively rich and I'm working long hours, well, then working more and making more money is probably going to be net negative for my happiness, even if the money does me some good because of all the things I have to sacrifice, time with my family and leisure and arts and culture and sports and golf and fishing or whatever it might be. And then the final example I wanted to mention is this idea of like solving for the equilibrium. It's a technical way of saying sort of thinking through the consequences of our actions actions. Because when we do things and when governments do things, they institute new policies and so on, people will adjust their behavior. But then other people will adjust their behavior in light of what other people did. And then even more people will adjust their behavior. So if you want to think through the consequences of some action, you cannot just think about the immediate short-term consequences. You have to think about like the long-term consequences as well.
In the face of urgent global problems like climate change, what's one economic principle you believe policymakers misunderstand or underuse?
Well, that last example, thinking in terms of equilibrium, solving for the equilibrium really is a big one. I'll just talk about one example. It's like traffic management. So many big cities have a lot of traffic, right? And in terms of economic costs, the costs are enormous. It affects people's quality of life, the air quality, and it reduces people's ability to get from one place to another. And then there are various sort of solutions to this in some US cities and elsewhere, like Los Angeles. They've tried to sort of build away the problem. You just keep building highways in the hope that things will fix themselves, right? But what happens when you build more highways is that people buy more cars and they move further out, and then the streets clog up once again. So this is an example of like solving for the equilibrium, right? It might look as though more highways is going to solve the problem, but that's only in the immediate short term. Recently, New York City instituted congestion charges, which are fees you have to pay when you drive a car onto the island of Manhattan, which has long been horribly congested. And this looks bad for cars, right? Drivers are often up in arms about these policies. It seems terrible, right? It's going to cost them a lot. But now the results are coming through, and it seems as though everyone is like overwhelmingly happy about this. Like people who live in the area are happy because there are fewer cars. People who ride bikes are happier because there are fewer cars that can kill them. And even the drivers are happier because the people who didn't have to drive their car to Manhattan now stay home. And what that means is that the carpenters, the workers, the delivery people, who have to be in Manhattan, they can get to where they need to be much faster. And to them, paying the small fee is cheap relative to what they're getting. So if you think through the consequences, there's one more example along these lines. So where I live in Stockholm, there's a discussion about bike lanes. And many people who drive are adamantly opposed to more bike lanes. They think of this as a favor to bikers. They think of it as like favoring bikers over drivers. They think of it as punishment for the drivers. But of course, what happens when you build more bicycle lanes and the city becomes more bikeable is that people will switch away from cars to bicycles. So many people who previously drove will now be riding about on bikes, which is much safer, better for the environment, and doesn't take as much space. So when you build good, functioning, connected bike lanes, this is good even for the drivers, right? And the people who have to drive, like wheelchair users, for example, who can't take a bike, right? They too have more space on the streets now. And so there are plenty of examples like this where positive, effective social change doesn't happen because people don't think through the full set of consequences of these policies.
Very insightful. Professor, you write with optimism about the potential for economics to improve lives. In a time of increasing polarization and distrust in institutions, what gives you that optimism?
Yeah, this is a big topic, and I might mention as a preface that this is part of why I wanted to write this book. So as a university professor, I meet a lot of young people, and what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing from them is, a great deal of things like climate anxiety, this feeling that the problems that we're facing are like so large, so insurmountable that there's little we can do about them, and some degree of decision paralysis. And obviously, like we shouldn't be denying the severity of the problems that we're facing, including, climate change and so on. At the same time, there's a science of all the big challenges, right? You talk about poverty or unhappiness or climate change or lack of organs or whatever. There are scientists who've been studying this for oftentimes like generations or 100 years. And these scientists have often proposed solutions as well that don't get as much attention as I think they should. Again, I don't think we should stop talking about the severity of the problem, but it's like if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you have a heart condition. Okay, fine, right? You want to know what the diagnosis is. You want them to tell you you're going to die one day if you are in fact going to die one day. You might want to know like what the situation is like. But once you've internalized the message, you don't want your doctor to keep going on about how sick you are. What you want the doctor to say next is something like, but the good news is that the outcome isn't cast in stone. You can affect the probabilities involved, and here are some things that you can do, whatever they are: exercise, eat better, drink less, and etc. And something similar is true when it comes to the massive societal challenges. I think we need to talk about the severity of the problem. But many young people in particular tell me that they know how severe the problems are. They've lived with this their entire lives. What they want to talk about is like, what can we do? And obviously, like science doesn't generate like magical wands and silver bullets and such, but science provides us with potential solutions that have been tested and that are grounded in evidence and that scientists broadly endorse. And the nice thing about these solutions is that they often sort of cut across like left right divides, and they often cut across like other kinds of societal divides. So if we can just have an open mind, a sufficiently open mind to listen to these proposals and think things through, we might find that they're acceptable to people with a wide range of backgrounds. So carbon taxes is an example, right? Overwhelmingly, like 99% of economists or something are in favor of carbon taxes, which are specific penalties on the people burning the fossil fuels. This is the kind of intervention that should be, appealing to the green movement and the environmental movement, right? Because it's a solution to sort of environmental and other problems. It should also be appealing to the conservatives and the free market liberals, because this kind of solution doesn't involve socializing the means of production. It means having a free market with supply and demand and freely floating prices and so on. And a proposal like this ought to appeal to Christians who believe that we're here to take care of creation. It ought to appeal to people on the left, because very often these sort of tax proposals are coupled with sort of compensation schemes for the people who are hurt by the taxes. So here's a proposal that really we ought to be able to build a very wide coalition behind. And I think that's appealing, because if we first had to agree on everything, political, theological, if we first had to endorse the same kind of values, then this would take a very long time. But the proposal here is such that we could conceivably agree on the specifics, even though you and I might have very different values and starting points and so on.
Professor, how can economic thinking help us design fairer systems, whether in education, housing, or healthcare, that actually leads to more just outcomes?
Yes, so maybe this is a good point to say that economics can't do everything, right? Economics can fix the world in the way that medicine can cure disease, not in and of itself, but if applied carefully and consistently by well-intentioned individuals and serious practitioners, and in light of a reasonable sense of ethics and aesthetics, right? No science is going to tell us like what a good educational system is like. No science is going to tell us what a fair economic distribution is like. So for that, we're going to have to turn to philosophical, normative reflection and reasoning and so on. But once we have a picture of like where we want to go, suppose we have a broad-based agreement that every human being deserves a basic education and, a certain level of literacy and a certain level of, civic knowledge and so on, so that everyone can be a full-fledged member of the imperfect democracies in which we live. Well, then economics and other social and behavioral sciences can tell us like, how do we build institutions that take us there? How do we encourage the sort of social norms that make this happen? And how do we encourage people to take advantage of the systems that exist? Like some parents hesitate to educate their children. What can we do to encourage them to send their children to school? These are like traditional social behavioral questions, and they're absolutely critical if we want to if we want to reach a world where every child has an education, as just one example.
Dr. Erik, I had privilege to hosting Dr. Griv Chelwa from South Africa, and he written a beautiful book, Can African Do Economics? And he focused on the behavioral part of economics. So, like you have also mentioned, behavioral economics plays a key role in your book. How does understanding human irrationality help us design better policies or social norms?
Yes, yes. So traditionally, economics was oriented around sort of some theory of rational choice, like some idea that some model that says that we're responding to incentives in a consistently rational way. And those models aren't all bad. I should say they're very useful in all sorts of ways, but they don't capture the way human beings actually act in a wide range of scenarios. And so what behavioral economics is a sort of enterprise of sort of dealing with that problem by incorporating more modern psychological theory into economics. This is good fun, for one thing. It's like a fun subset of economics, but it's also really helpful if we're talking about building institutions. Suppose we're talking about building a healthcare system or a pension system that benefits everyone alike. Well, if that pension system only works when it's populated by rational, well-informed, people with no myopia or anything, then it's going to fail in the real world when we populate it with real live human beings made from flesh and blood. And so very often it might be a useful starting point to think about how would rational agents behave in the context of this institution. But before we roll it out in India or anywhere, we have to ask, what are the people like who are going to live, who are going to operate, and who are going to deal with this institution? What are they going to do, that conforms to our expectations, and where will they act differently? And so I think the behavioral perspective on these sorts of problems is like absolutely critical to make them work in the real world. I mean, we can do real harm if we build an institution that only works when everyone involved is like ideally rational. People might be worse off afterwards than they were before, and we might ruin the opportunity for building a better one. Like maybe people will say, well, the last time we let the economists through the gate, everything went to hell, right? We're not going to make that mistake again. So I think from an economics perspective, it's really important that we think through the consequences of what we're doing in a world where people aren't consistently rational and well informed.
One of your goals is to make economics more human and humane. What needs to change in how economics is taught and practiced to achieve that?
Yeah, I think the teaching of economics is really kind of critical. So you mentioned at the outset, like how economics has a reputation for being cold and oriented around sort of hard numbers like GDP and stock market indices and so on. And somehow, what we need to do if we're going to increase the literacy, the economic literacy, and the willingness to listen to the kind of very sensible proposals that economists propose, we have to think about like how we teach the young generation in particular. Right now, the way that we teach it across the world is still very much oriented around certain kinds of models. If you study economics from any one of the standard textbooks that are available across the globe, it'll start with some theory of rational choice. And then the only question is like how far into the book or how far into the course of study you need to go before you get stories like, incomplete or asymmetric information and behavioral components and so on. And to my mind, I think we really ought to sort sort of turn that upside down. I think the teaching of economics should be more problem-based. My friends who study medicine or have studied medicine tell me that something similar has happened in medicine, where 40 years ago or something, by and large, you studied theory after theory after theory, when now the way that medicine is taught is more oriented around problems. So here's a patient with the following symptoms. What do you think might be going on? Like, you can cover the same amount of material by starting with a real case and then working your way up the ladder of abstraction. But it tends to be a little more applied and a little more sensible, and it gives the participant, the student, a much better picture of what you can do with medicine or with economics. So I think we have a tall order, we have a lot to do, and it's something that we, the profession, the economics profession, have to do. The sooner the better.
Dr. Eric, my last question. If there's a one economic idea you wish every listener could take away and start using from today, what would it be and how might it change their perspective on the world?
Let me talk about something that's a little unexpected, maybe, and it has to do with reducing overconfidence. I love talking about this because economists have a reputation for being overconfident themselves, right? But behavioral economists have studied overconfidence for like 50 years now, and it's one of the more stable phenomena. Like, more or less everyone is affected by overconfidence, at least some of the time, or at least much of the time. And what we mean by overconfidence is sort of a scenario where you have an excessive faith in your own knowledge and abilities. So if you ask people questions, for example, and you ask them how certain are you of your answer, like what do you think the probability is that you are right, people like radically overestimate the probability that they're right as compared to like the frequency with which they're right. So this is very common. All of us are affected by this to some degree or other. There are some minor exceptions, but they're quite few and far between, like in the case of extremely easy questions, for example. The other thing about overconfidence is that it's really kind of resilient. Just telling people about overconfidence doesn't seem to hurt, it doesn't seem to help. Sometimes if you talk about it in general terms, people will be willing to concede that they're sometimes wrong. So, if you ask me, Eric, are you sometimes wrong? I might say, oh yeah, I know I'm wrong. It's happened before. But if you ask me about specific claims that I make, I'll be a lot less prone to admitting that I might be wrong about that. So there's an inconsistency or a sort of a weird sort of situation there. So the first sort of insight here, I think, is that we're affected by this a very large part of the time, and it might affect our performance in the world as human beings and as investors and business people and academics and doctors and so on. Now, what are we supposed to do about this? And this is kind of cool because people have studied the conditions or the interventions that you can engage in, to reduce your level of overconfidence. And the most effective one of the most effective ones that I've seen is just like reminding yourself of reasons that you might be wrong. This is cool because we're so used to thinking about reasons that we might be right. If I come here and I say something, you might challenge me, and I anticipate that you might challenge me. And so I've prepared myself mentally for that. And I've prepared like a list of reasons that I'm right. And because we constantly go around sort of rehearsing the reasons why we're right, we exaggerate in our minds the probability that we're right because we have so many reasons floating around in our heads, right? And so if you ask people to reflect on the reasons they might be wrong, you sort of force them to think through the scenarios where they're wrong, the scenarios they haven't thought about. And just by virtue of doing that, you remind yourself that there are some reasons to think otherwise, and that it is an effective way to reduce your overconfidence. There are some specific strategies as well. You can think about, what do the people who disagree with me think? So suppose you're out there buying stocks. You think, this is a good time to buy airline stock or something. You could ask yourself, well, who's on the other side of that trade? Well, if you're buying, right, somebody else is selling, who's that person? And overwhelmingly, that person is going to be an institutional investor. It's going to be somebody with training, experience, computer systems, a lot more information than you have probably, right? And they've decided to sell. What might make them sell, right? This is good exercise that you can do for cheap in your head. And if you do that, you're likely to think of reasons to be a little more cautious and reasons to be a little less overconfident.
Listeners, it's been a true honor to have Professor Erik Angner from Stockholm University with us today's podcast. His unique interdisciplinary perspective, rooted in both economics and philosophy, offers a powerful reminder that economics isn't just about numbers or market, but about people, values, and choices. Through his book, How Economics Can Save the World, Professor Erik challenges us to rethink what economics is for and shows us how it can be force for good in addressing some of the most pressing issues of our time, from inequality and climate change to everyday decisions that shape our communities. We are grateful for the depth, clarity, and optimism he's brought to this conversation. If today's episode has inspired you look at the world a little bit differently, or to ask better questions about how systems work, then it's done its job. Thank you, Professor Erik, for sharing your insights, and thank you, our listeners, for joining us. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember, economics done right can help us better a world. Thank you so much, Professor Erik.
Thank you so much, Deepak. It was a pleasure.